Class, this is going to be Chapter 7 from Goldstein and Peevehouse, right? International organizations. We're going to talk about international organizations, norms, right? Specifically, the UN is going to be the major focus, and then we're going to end with some international law. The first part is that all international law, these organizations, they all come from these international norms. So international norms define what is the acceptable range of behavior for states. Now, if you have these norms, right, that exist in the system, you can start to restrain state behavior without force. And one of the things that has become the most obvious norm in the current system is that you can't invade other states for territory. This is just not a practice that's acceptable anymore, right? You do have the annexing of Crimea by Russia, right, but that's the first time since 1945 that you see sort of territory changed hands by force, right? And there wasn't really a force, there was just sort of this implied threat, right? And they would argue the same thing that Iraq argued, right? Was that the Crimea was always part of Russia, the same way that Iraq argued that Kuwait was part of Iraq. So when you have these violations, they're fairly rare. And part of this is driven by this habitual factor that between 1945 and 1990, you did not see a lot of territory change hand by force. You had the United States and the Soviet Union breaking up states, but you didn't have them taking over the territory, sort of just redefining that. So this habitual practice is this practice of norms because it's how norm internalization works. You do the same thing over and over and over again, right? Many of you do this in your daily lives. You go through this process, and then eventually you accept some sort of norm in your personal life, and then it changes your behavior, right? You won't do certain things. I won't walk on grass, right? There's no rule against walking on grass when UNLV campus was open, but I wouldn't walk on grass because it had been internalized in my behavior. The other part is legitimacy, right? This is a source of non-coercive power. So when you have legitimacy, right, these are rules that you respect regardless of enforcement, that the states respect regardless of enforcement. And one of the things that we see after World War II is that states don't have colonies anymore. The US was in a position to be a colonial power. It chose not to be a colonial power after World War II. Now, we'll talk about new colonial behavior, or whether or not trade openness is colonialism, right? There are all these factors that come into play. But for now, right, we're going to accept that colonial powers fall off in 1945, and this legitimacy becomes non-coercive power where the states agree to it. We're going to go quite quickly through this only because it's too much to cover in one session, so we're going to do a lot of review in future sessions. If I'm going too fast, I will come back to it later. Right, there are international organizations. IOs is the broad over term. The other part is intergovernmental organizations. So intergovernmental organizations have member states, right? This is the UN, right? The United States, Japan, South Korea, Mexico, Germany, Qatar, Qatar, if you're from the military, right? Egypt, South Africa, all states in the UN. The states make up voting blocks, so the World Trade Organization works as part of the UN, right? And this trade organization has all of these blocks, right? If you're part of ASEAN, right, this is Southeast Asian community. If you're part of Mercosur, right, that's the sort of European-Russian trade agency, right? Or if you're part of the EU, right, all of these blocks exist. The other part is a non-governmental organization. We'll talk about this a lot. A non-governmental organization has very declared policy. We talked about before, the Red Cross is the most obvious example. The Red Cross doesn't care about economics. It doesn't care about, right, a lot of other factors. It cares about decreasing the human suffering, right? How do we provide health care? How do we provide immunization to those groups? And we'll continue to talk about that as we go through this semester. The other part is transnational advocacy networks. This is new, it's not in the text. So I'm introducing this because you have advocacy networks that are not from that state that are trying to influence that state. And Keck and Sinkink have a really good book. If you're a political science, you want to get in this. It's called Activists Without Borders. And the idea is that you can, as an American citizen, you can influence the behavior of another state. That has, right, strengths and weaknesses. Americans can influence the behavior of Ghana more effectively than the domestic population of Ghana because Americans can find all this funding and they can make arguments like, okay, we want to build a bridge or a well, but you have to do these things that we want to do. And transnational advocacy networks allow citizens of the world to influence other countries, but what we know from Keck and Sekink is that Americans and Europeans start influencing those states like Ghana, like the Congo, but as they are listening to foreign influence, they don't listen to their domestic population as much. So when you have transnational advocacy networks, they can actually work against the domestic population because it takes away their influence over the government because the government is responding to foreign nationals rather than their domestic population. All right, we're going to talk about a lot about the United Nations. So the United Nations has a symbolic role, right? This is like promotes international order, right? You can always go to the UN, right? You see them as working together. The same way the Olympics works is a symbolic role. It's not about what it's doing, it's the symbols that it upholds. The other part is that it is a forum. So if you have a dispute, you want to have some sort of grievance, right? States can have their voices in this forum in the General Assembly, and it allows them to exchange ideas and say problems and sort of promote issues that they think are important. In the General Assembly, you do not have what is in the Security Council, and in the Security Council you can resolve security issues. The reason why security issues go to the Security Council is because the resolutions that are passed in the UN General Assembly, the UNGA, are non-binding, right? They don't have an enforcement mechanism, so they have to be upheld by the states. The states have to choose to follow them. In the UN Security Council, these are binding, which means I can put troops on the ground, I can have forces, I can imply sanctions, all of these things can happen. Because of that, you can have binding resolutions in the Security Council. Binding resolutions are very rare, right? It's the non-binding resolutions that you see most commonly. Now, non-binding resolutions, they follow the norm entrepreneur footwork, right? So you have a new person saying that this norm should exist, and they create a proposal for the UN General Assembly, whether it's in one of the smaller committees, that's not really important. Eventually it gets to the UN General Assembly, and it's this change in norms. And how do we change these norms to a non-binding resolution? We say this is what states should be doing, and this is what states should be doing for their people, right? Remember that the UN is member states, right? The states are the members. So these non-binding resolutions are arguments to the states that they should be doing something for their members. It also fills a much more obvious role if we're talking about just the economics of diplomacy, is that it reduces transaction costs. And by transaction costs, I mean the amount of effort or money or energy used to communicate with another state. So the most obvious example is the full-time staff of the UN. The UN is supposed to have less bias. They're part of this international community. They're not representing the interests. And when you see this, what will happen is in part, you have an arbiter, right? You have some sort of mediator between the two of you that's not from either country, right? If you're Sweden and you have an issue with Japan, then you get someone from wherever, from Brazil, and that Brazilian mediates because they're not part of those states. They don't share the same interests. The other part is translators. Translation is very, very expensive. There are a lot of languages. So the full-time staff makes it much easier for states to communicate because they have translators there that don't have those state biases. So it makes it easier for that translation to occur, and because that translation can occur much faster, right? You can reduce the transaction cost, and so you can speed up and decrease the cost of communication and diplomacy. And we know that the easier it is to communicate, the less likely you're going to have a violent conflict, right? You have armed conflict, and instead you're going to find some other way, right? This is the ease of communication. It's easier to communicate as well because you have state representation. The UN ambassador to the UN, the US ambassador to the UN, excuse me, is always there, right? There is always an ambassador or some sort of representation of the US at the UN and all of the other states. So whatever they need to communicate, this gives them a constant forum. So this helps peace along because of that constant communication. They can resolve issues more easily, and the cost of resolving issues, remember rational choice says, right, you're going to take the reward that has the highest benefit and the lowest cost. Well, we've decreased the cost of peace, which means that peace is now more likely to occur under a rational choice thought process. We go to the Security Council, right? If I didn't mention it, right, the UN General Assembly, every state is a member, right? You have 193, probably 195 right now. So any state that exists, it's universal membership. Every state is a member. Every state has one vote, one state, right? So it's plurality, right? You can have a voice in the GA. And the UN Security Council, it's not the same thing. First, the binding resolutions, right? You can actually put troops on the ground for some of these. And then the permanent 5 members we've talked about, UK, France, China, Russia, and the United States. They all have single veto power, which means they can just outright say no to anything that happens. And when we talk about the UN Secretary General, right, this is going to really matter because they can veto anything. And the way a single veto works in the UN Security Council is that that one state says no, and then there's no more debate. That is just vetoed, and that is done with. So vetoes are very, very powerful in the UN Security Council. The other part is that, right, the Security Council can take up any issue, and they can have funds and troops go to it, but they need 9 members to vote it, right? So you have 10 non-permanent members, and you need at least 9 to vote on it, right? Now, even if they don't veto, the 5 permanent members can abstain, or they can vote no without a veto. Actually, that's not true. If they vote no, it is a veto. But they can abstain. So you need 9 yes votes to pass. So there are 10 non-permanent members. They rotate. There's a book by Vreeland and Dreyer on this, but it's more complex than this course requires. So the non-permanent members do have a vote, but they don't have veto power. So the P5 really play an important role in this in the Security Council. Real quick history, you have the League of Nations failing right after World War I. The US says, okay, our interests aren't aligned with this international organization. In 1945, they rearranged the League of Nations to be the United Nations, and the US supports the United Nations, which gets a lot of other states on board. So in 45, you have 51 states, but the US says the headquarters has to be in New York, right? And they changed the UN so that it fits with US interests. Then during that, between 1945 and 1971, you have the communist regime take over China, you have the nationalists go to Taiwan, and between 45 and 71, the Taiwanese nationalists are on the P5. And then in 71, you see this sort of peaceful shift where the communist regime takes over that P5, which means they now have, right, the Chinese government switches, but it's in recognition that the communist regime is in control of China, and they're part of the P5. What happens is, because you have all these new states coming in, and you have this switch over between, right, communist China being part of the P5 and all this switch over, then the US starts having to say, okay, there are 150 states, 190 states now, most of them coming from the global south, they're outside of Western influence, so the United States becomes the dominant veto user. They're constantly vetoing things that don't fit with their national interest. Then in 1989, between 1989 and 91, depending on how we sort of frame this, right, the Soviet Union collapses, all of these states move out. Russia absorbs the debt and treaties of the Soviet Union, so it becomes a P5 member, but that wasn't a guarantee. Right, Russia was still a very large power, right, but there could have been an argument by Yugoslavia or some of the Ukraine or some of the other states that they should get that, but none of them wanted to take on the debt, and it was sort of tied to that, right? If you respect the treaties and the debt of the Soviet Union, then you become the P5 member, and Russia was the obvious successor. It's a much larger state than the other states of the Soviet Union. In 1992, Boutros Boutros-Ghali is the UN Secretary General. He writes this sort of outcome document, and he calls it an agenda for peace. And he says that now that the Cold War is over, right, Soviet Union collapses, Cold War ends, now that it's over, we need to start involving ourselves in this international community, and we need to start coming to the aid of people. And so this becomes the spark point for these 3 pillars of the new UN, right? The UN goes to what it was originally thought to be, right? And these 3 pillars are security, right? Individual security, human security, right? People have a right to life and liberty and jobs and food and health, right? This is not state security, this is individual security. The other part is economic development, right? Building infrastructure up and roads and bridges. but also opening trade, right? The Washington Consensus is during this time period, so a lot of economists argue that if you want to build up your economy, you should open yourself to trade and sort of focus on the things you're really good at. This is called comparative advantage, right? But also at the same time, you need to build bridges, you need to build roads, you need to have that underlying infrastructure if your economy is going to work. And as you're building these roads and the infrastructure, it'll be easier for you to provide human security. And then the last part is human rights. This universal suffrage, which we call versus what's called right to life. And we'll talk about this later, the sort of positive versus negative rights, right? You should have the right to voice your opinion in your country, right? This is a universal declaration that becomes part of the UN's identity. And you should have a right to say what you want to say. And then the other part is the government should be providing you with resources and protecting you from discrimination or from harm in the case of a genocide. So human rights is part of it. These three pillars work together. You have to provide human rights and security and economic development together. That's the only way it's going to work. So this becomes this baseline 3 pillars. So if you're going to require a lot of these things, you need to get involved. And the UN Security Council can send in troops, but they send in 2 different types of troops, observers and peacekeeping forces. Now, observers, they are just looking at a problem. And usually observers come in first and they try to figure out what is the actual problem. Is the problem like Kosovo, where there's not enough food and warlords are hoarding that food, and if we just flood that market with food, then that war over food won't work and those warlords will collapse and you can sort of have a peace agreement? Or is this an ethnic genocide, an ethnic cleansing, and we need troops to come in right now before one population is dead, right? So when you have observers, it's very important that they come first because they need to identify a problem. They also need to find a way for it to get international recognition so that the community, right, these are member states, they have to be incentivized to be part of this. You have to convince the United States and China and France and Russia and the UK that this is important and we need to step in. Then once you step in, the way that UN peacekeeping forces is a little different. They do what's called an interposing. They stand in between the warring parties, right, the attacker and the victim, and they stand in between them and they say, no, don't fight, and they just put their bodies in the way. And this has become a very risky, right? It's very dangerous for the UN peacekeepers, but it's a very effective way to end conflict between 2 groups because the consequences are so different. If you are a state and you attack UN forces, there's going to be a lot of problems, and those problems are different because there are different norms for attacking UN forces versus 2 warring parties in a state. If you have 2 groups in a state, right, even if it's a genocide, even if it's Darfur, even if it's Rwanda, these genocides, they're still seen as civil conflicts, and it's hard to tell who's right and who's wrong in these civil conflicts. But when you put these bodies in the way, these human shields, right, which is a very negative way to talk about them, right, but UN peacekeepers stand in the way, they use their bodies to get in the way, they're protected by international norms, which is also why they don't get harmed as much, right? You don't want to shoot a cop, you don't want to shoot in someone from the UN because the consequences are much higher. So this interposing of the UN peacekeeping forces is very effective because of that, and it's norms driven, not force driven, because the UN forces don't have better armament, they don't have better weapons, it's just that the norms that protect them are much stronger. So whenever you have an issue, it is always championed by the UN Secretariat, right? And the UN Secretariat is the offices and the professional staff and all of this bureaucracy that exists. And it's led by the UN Secretary General. But the UN Secretary General doesn't represent the population, he doesn't represent the people, he represents the member states. He is elected and nominated by the UN member states. So the first part is that if you want to be nominated as the UN Secretary General, you have to get through the P5. And the P5 will get rid of anyone they don't like, right? Boutros Boutros-Ghali in '92 comes with the agenda for peace. He's very effective, right? He's supported by the population, but then he gets vetoed by the P5 because they don't like how activist he's being. They don't like how active he's being and how much he's pushing for human rights and how the consequences that is to the member states. So the P5 get rid of Boutros Boutros-Ghali, and right now it's Antonio Guterres. He's been in for a while, but not long enough to look at his legacy. A lot of the Secretary Generals, they have specific issues. Ban Ki-moon was from South Korea, and one of the issues he picked up was HIV/AIDS because he believed that there was a way to get rid of this. We now see a lot of new medicines and a lot of sort of containment policies, right, to sort of limit how much HIV/AIDS is spreading in the world, and that has a lot to do with Ban Ki-moon's initiatives and trying to get people aware of how AIDS is spread, right, information campaigns and things like that. So all of these Secretary Generals have their pet projects. They try to promote them. A couple of them have Nobel Peace Prizes for their work. They have to be nominated, so they have to be very careful. They have to make sure they're still in line with the member states, specifically the P5, so they can get nominated. And then the other part is they get elected by the UN General Assembly. So if you make the P5 happy, but you upset the entire Global South, you won't get elected. So you have to walk this very, very careful balance between the powerful states that are permanent members of the Security Council and all of the other states, right? Because there are 195. So the 5 powerful states versus 195 voters, you're always trying to balance those two issues. And this creates what's called a principal agent problem. And some of you might have heard this before. The Secretariat, the bureaucracy, has its own agenda. They want to solve problems. So they have agency, right? In a system, you have agency. That's the constructivist paradigm, right? There are all these rules, but these individuals have their own agency and their own goals, and so they're always trying to mix and match between the two. How do I avoid a single veto from a P5 member, but also get my goals done? And this creates this principal agent problem where the principal, the principal, right, is the member states. They want the Secretary General to do one thing, and the agent, the Secretary General, wants to do another. And so you always have a little bit of leeway, right? No matter who your boss is, you always have a little bit of wiggle room in what you can do. And so that principal agent problem exists in all employer-employee relationships. It exists for the Secretariat and the UN Secretary General and the member states. And so whenever you have that problem with who wants to do what and how do those goals align. And the less those goals align, the more likely you to have this problem. And as this problem becomes more of an issue, the more likely that one of the P5 members will veto that individual. All right, the UN runs primarily on programs. So I am going to go quickly through this. I want to get under 35 minutes because upload times are really bad on my computer. So UN Environment Program is this huge program now. It was in the early 1990s saying that we need to make a major shift to avoid climate change. This has been 30 years now of scientists and the UN saying that we are running up against a cliff, which makes it sound like it's not much of a cliff. It's been 30 years, right? We are probably past the point of mediation, right? It's probably past the point where we can solve climate change, and now we need to start adapting to climate change. We're actually living in a society that's very different right now because of this pandemic, but pandemics are supposedly more likely in the next 10 years, 10 to 20 years, so we're going to see more pandemics, more hurricanes, more typhoons, more damage from the natural environment over the next 20 years, and the UNEP has been saying this for a long period of time. The UN Development Program deals with funding projects, right? They get a lot of aid. This is sort of donations from individuals and other states and governments and NGOs, and they fund projects. So the benefit is that they'll go and they'll build a well or they'll build a clean water facility in a state. The problem is that the UNDP does not always involve itself with the domestic population. So this is the same thing that we have with transnational advocacy networks, right? You have the UNDP go in and they try and solve a problem, but they don't work with the domestic population. So in South America, they build a couple of facilities that are designed to process all these tubers and these agriculture that grow, but there's no transportation networks in those communities. So you build this warehouse in this facility and it's set up to be very functional, but there's no way to get the produce to that facility. So it just gets mothballed immediately. So it's a disastrous project because it's not involving the domestic community. So you're trying to do good work with this UNDP, but it's not always as functional because you're not involving the domestic population, which is always a problem, right? You will see this over and over again as we go through this. We want to solve the problem, but we're not engaging with the domestic community, and so the solution we come up with is either not functional or it doesn't apply to that community at all. So we always have to worry about that, right? Are we taking into account the domestic factors, right? This is constructivism, this is contextualism. Are we taking into account the agency of those individuals and the factors on the ground that apply, right? And this is also intersubjective. How do they perceive this factory versus the way that what the factory actually does? So all of these things matter in the UNDP, the UN High Commissioner of Issues we talked about, right? This is how we determine responsibility. What was the first step? What country was first stepped into? And that determines the responsibility to that country for that refugee. So this program is very effective today. There were a lot of refugees. There isn't a lot of refugee movement right now because of this global pandemic, but we will see in the next couple of years more and more refugees dealing with this issue. And the solution that we have seen is some states just fly them because the wording is so right. International law is so specific. It says where do they first set foot on. If you fly them over that country, they never set foot in that country. So flights have become the solution. But it's a very weird solution to a legal process where they could just say, oh, I take responsibility, now get them here, right? And also flights very, very expensive versus moving large populations on the ground would be easier, right? And we'll talk about international law in a second. The UN also has autonomous agencies. One of the autonomous agencies that we've talked about in the past is the International Atomic Energy Agency, right? This was the inspectors that went into Iraq in 2003 that didn't find any weapons of mass destruction. They're supposed to be looking for weaponized use, right? So their part of their job is preventing proliferation. So going into states and saying, are you using nuclear material to make weapons? But they also are trying to help peaceful use proliferation. So you want to get countries to use nuclear energy to make factories, to advance medicine, right? The Iranian nuclear medicine program has a lot of advances. So there are diseases and there are treatments and discoveries that exist only in Iran that we don't have in the US. There are actually some cancers that are better treated in Iran than the United States because they have a better nuclear medicine program. So the IAEA is working on both fronts, right? How do we promote this use of nuclear medicine so that we have more health discoveries throughout the world and make sure they're not using that same technology to make weapons? So they're trying to find this very careful balance. And then the World Health Organization, right, is always trying to improve health conditions. And one of the biggest things is immunization projects. We're likely going to see the WHO become really prominent in the next few years because as soon as we get a vaccine or some sort of immunization for the coronavirus, there's going to be a lot of need to distribute it in places that don't have great healthcare projects, right? In the US, right, we'll probably likely see it like a flu shot. We just need enough people to get into it, right? Enough people to take it to get this herd effect, this herd immunity. But in places that are very poor, don't have the infrastructure, the World Health Organization is going to make these big programs to try and insulate this. You've seen them become very prominent because we've had a lot of outbreaks of diseases that used to be not as big of an issue or didn't spread as quickly, but in a global community, right, very, very dangerous, right? Ebola was the most recent, right? But we've always had something, right? New diseases are always coming and hitting us, and so the World Health Organization has a very large role. So now we're going to talk about international law for a second. International law comes from four sources. The first is treaties. And the reason why treaties are the most powerful part of this is because states sign them. States agree to these rules. In the United States, when a treaty is ratified by Congress, because we have a very unique system where the president has to sign it, and then it has to be ratified by Congress. If it's ratified by Congress, that treaty becomes the law of the land, which means that when the U.S. agrees to a treaty, it becomes domestic law. We apply it as a law in the United States, right? It becomes legal statute. So treaties are very, very powerful. The next part is custom, right? Custom is habitual, so we've always done it this way, so this is the way it's done, right? We could argue it could be the same thing as tradition, and so when things are repeated over and over and over again, then you have this factor where we expect you to behave in the same way, right? If you've always had the same interactions, then now that becomes the standard for what we're doing in the law. The next part is your general principles of law, or what is equitable, right? Stealing is never equitable. You're taking without giving. So stealing is illegal in the international community because it is not equitable. And then the last part is legal scholarship. And this comes from this doctrine that's actually Latin prima stare. It just means let the decision stand in Latin. And this is all about case precedent, right? In America, we use this language called case precedent. And that just means that we've had cases like this before, and we're going to use similar cases to decide the next cases. So these are the 4 sources of international law. We're actually going to talk about this more later, so I'm going to move on. You have the World Court. It used to be called the International Court of Justice. It provides impartial hearings, and what matters here is that the states choose to abide by these decisions, right? It is like the People's Court, right? If you're a little older, right, or Judge Judy or whatever the language of today is, those 2 individuals agree to accept whatever decision is made by the court. So it is not an enforceable in the same way that an American court system is, but the states will abide by it. And one of the reasons that they will do that, right, why would they agree to something if it's not in favor of them, right, is because you'd rather have laws, and maybe you don't get the decision that you want, but you'd rather have laws that fit all the time, right? We know what the laws are going to be. We can expect the outcome. We might not get exactly what we want all the time, but we know that rules exist. So states will often choose to follow these international laws, not because there's an enforcement mechanism, because they'd rather have some laws than complete lawlessness, because then you don't know what to expect, right? And expected behavior, routines, habit, customs, these are all very important to states because they want to know how things are going to work. You want to know that when you ship your merchant vessel, right, when you load up your goods and you ship them out to the world, that they're going to arrive. So you need a lot of customs and a lot of rules and a lot of habits and a lot of traditions for that to happen. So you accept these decisions because you want some form of rule of law. Right. Now, laws of diplomacy are a little different. Diplomatic recognition is when one state recognizes another state and says certain people are representatives of that state and need to be recognized. When they are recognized, they get diplomatic immunity. Now, diplomatic immunity isn't going to be important for us right now. It just means that some minor laws don't apply to you. And the biggest one in New York is that you can park anywhere if you have diplomatic plates, right? And New York City hates it, but they have all these parking and fire lanes and handicap places and all of this that they have to deal with. The part that matters for us in IR is diplomatic pouches, which we've actually talked about before. You don't search them. When they don't go through customs, they don't go through metal detectors. Diplomatic pouches would be the easiest way to get a weapon from one state to another. Diplomatic pouches are protected from search, so if you wanted to deliver a bomb, right, and they're fairly large pouches, they're not small envelope size, they're big briefcase size. So these pouches are large enough that you could slip in a weapon, that you could have all these problems. And diplomatic pouches are going to become this security issue that we'll continue to talk about moving forward. All right, we've talked about like justifying a war, and today almost all countries have identified this just war doctrine. So the only time that you can go to war is in response to aggression, right? The only time that the US will go to war, arguably, is that when they are attacked or their interests are attacked. So you can repel, right? If someone invades you, you can repel, but you can also punish those that are aggressors, right? And this is going back to Fioron, right? An aggressor state demands something, you say, well, I'll go to war. I'm not going to pay for your whatever you want. I'm not going to give you. And you can go to war and you can punish them because you've had this cost, right? This cost of going to war. So you can punish. And then you can also come to defense of an ally. Sometimes we talk about the United States defense of a third person, but defending an ally is part of just war doctrine. And we discovered this in Kuwait, right? We knew, but an example of this is in Kuwait in 1992, right? The U.S. comes to the defense of Kuwait as Iraq aggresses, and they punish, right, the Saddam Hussein regime and damage their military, but do not occupy because they didn't want that as one of their policy goals. The other part is even after you go to war, laws still exist, right? We talk about the laws and rules of engagement, right? But the part that is biggest is the Geneva Convention. And one of the things that came out of the Geneva Convention is that there were a lot of things that were in wartime that were so inhumane and so damaging that they need to be removed. And one of the most obvious examples is a flamethrower. Now, a flamethrower is not a good combat weapon. It does not protect you, right? You have to be very close up, right? It's not an effective weapon as far as winning a war. What it is an effective weapon is that the damage, the pain, the fear of burning to death is so strong that it creates a psychological effect. But burning to death is such an awful way to die, and it's so inhumane, right, that the Geneva Convention determined that this was inappropriate behavior even during wartime. And that's what really matters, right? Chemical attacks and flamethrowers and even landmines today, all inappropriate during wartime. And so we need to get rid of those. And so these laws exist during wartime. And if you violate those, then we have some issues dealing with human rights. And so human rights come in two forms, right? A lot of human rights come from this idea from Kant, intrinsic human value, but also, right, political revolutions, the French and American Revolution say, right, humans, actually say men are created equal, but, right, we've expanded that to all humans, right, created equal have certain rights, inalienable rights, right? You cannot give away these rights. So there are negative rights. The negative rights are the government should not interfere, right? When we say negative, it means freedom from intervention. And this will be in, if you took Political Science 101, you should have covered this already, right? You have free speech, you have free assembly, you have freedom of religion, right? These are all things that you have. The government should not interfere in your daily life when it comes to what you say and what you believe and who you associate with. Unless, right, association with known felons is a different factor. The other part is positive rights. Now, this really comes into play when we talked about responsibility to protect before. It's not important that you know about responsibility to protect. I'm just using it as an example. We're going to talk about it in a minute. But what matters here is that the government should interfere, right? These positive rights means the government should intervene, and they should make sure that you have living conditions that are suitable, and food and education. And these are predominantly economic factors. So the state has to provide you with certain things. And we know what a lot of them are because the UN came out with what's called a Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And you can look this up, and it has a lot of things. It's just not something we're going to cover today. It has a lot of factors and a lot of rights that humans have, that all humans right. And then it includes suffrage, it includes the ability to have food and health care, and some of the things that we don't even have in the United States are part of this Declaration of Human Rights. When you violate some of these things, it can become a war crime if it's a crime against humanity. And in order to manage these crimes against humanity, the Hague trial was the first one in the former Yugoslavia that led to the creation of the International Criminal Court. And the way that it works is a state will turn over an individual. They'll say this individual needs to be tried in the international community for what they have done. And it brings about, right, you have the ICC created, you have individuals who committed genocide being punished for war crimes, right? The Hague and the International Criminal Court, they find all these generals and these officers who were part of a genocide or part of some sort of other war crime, and they're punished, and it starts to create this doctrine of responsibility to protect. Even though we say it comes from the UN, it actually comes from some scholars well before the UN. And this redefines sovereignty, right? And we know that redefined sovereignty, what matters here is the doctrine starts to say that you must protect your citizens from harm. And this becomes legal precedent, right? The international law legal precedent, because a lot of cases have decided this. Now international law has formed around these sources, right? The treaties and the case precedent that you have to protect your own citizens. Okay. So I went through a lot today. We're going to do a review session before the next exam. We are going to have an online exam. It's going to be take home in a fashion because I'm going to remove the timer. There's been a lot of headaches with the timer. I want to give you as much time as possible. This video should upload, and then I will be in the chat. Thank you very much.